Good morning. My name is Sarah Logeman, and I am thankful to be in worship with you and honored to guest preach at Eastside this morning. My husband, Dave, it's the Logeman circus this morning, liturgy and sermon. My husband, Dave, and I have attended this church for close to 5 years, have been married for close to 3, and are now renovating a West End bungalow for what seems like 10, but it's only been 5 short months. We have affectionately and rather ironically named our home Miss Classy. She is 106 years old, and as you would expect of a house that has held over a century of life within its walls, the wood floors creak, the plaster walls are cracking, the door and window molding boasts at least 4 layers of chippy paint. The roof shingles are sun-bleached and they're now brittle. We often laugh together at the absurdity of restoring something so old. But just when we think our old lady has little life left to give, we rediscover some of the character that we came to adore about her initially, and we get back to work. In our scripture passage this morning, we encounter another old lady. Her name is Sarah, and she is 90. She is married to Abraham, who is 99. And we find Abraham and Sarah at the climax of a much larger story that has been unfolding for decades. They have been struggling to see how God would fulfill a promise to create a great nation from Abraham's descendants, a promise they understand to hinge on their bearing of a son. But when we find the two in Genesis chapter 18, they are advanced in age, have no children together, are understandably a combination of desperate and weary, and they're finally receiving an answer about how this promise will unfold. So please stand if you are able for a reading from God's Word. We're in Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, and he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age, and it had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old, and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son, But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Oh yes, you did laugh." This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. God made a covenant with Abraham that he would be the ancestor of a multitude of generations and nations. And God even sent him to the land where he and his offspring would live, Canaan. So Abraham and Sarah have traveled there and are living in that place, waiting to see how this covenant would be fulfilled. And finally, they have an answer brought to them by a group of 3 men. This answer is incredibly straightforward, but also completely absurd. A baby will be born, but to Sarah, who is 90. And this answer is not revelatory. It's not an aha moment for them, not a "why didn't we think of that" kind of scene. They have indeed tried to conceive a child, to help this promise of God's along, but time after time found themselves to be barren. At one point, they even enlisted the help of Sarah's own slave, Hagar, who did conceive a son with Abraham. But that was not the way that God envisioned the promise unfolding. The way in which God's promise will be fulfilled, we learn that Sarah will indeed have a son, was communicated to her husband Abraham before. And when he heard it, back in chapter 12, he literally fell to the ground in laughter. Loud, comical, disbelieving laughter. And now in chapter 18, we see Sarah hearing this news for the first time. And like a delayed echo, Sarah laughs too, but to herself. Abraham and Sarah both laugh, but I want to focus on Sarah and her own brand of laughter, because her response and her dialogue and exchange with God is really at the crux of this text and has a lot to teach us about ourselves and who God is. There's a cheeky phrase that floats around Christian circles that you may have heard before or may even have used. If you want to make God laugh, tell God your plans. I've heard this phrase used before as comic relief when life gets derailed and things happen that you don't see coming and certainly didn't plan for, when the shape of life shifts and heads in a new direction, or even as an acknowledgement of the futility of busying yourself with grand plans, knowing that God's are even grander. But if we tweak this popular phrase a bit, maybe even turn it over on itself, it can help to explain what is happening in our text. Hear the difference. If you want to laugh, listen to God's plans. If you want to laugh, listen to God's plans. Sarah listens to God's plans, and she laughs. And the kind of laugh is made explicit in the text. She laughs to herself. One translation even uses the wording, she laughs within herself. So the laugh is not audible. You can't hear it. And if you remember, she isn't even in the scene when the phrase, "Sarah shall bear a son," is spoken. She actually overhears this news, almost on accident, and then responds by laughing to herself. I can picture her standing there at the tent entrance. She's probably eavesdropping. Her neck swivels, her ears perk up, her eyes probably roll, and then comes the laugh. It is not a joyous laugh. It is not an excited laugh. It is certainly a doubt-filled, bordering on scornful laugh. And who could blame Sarah? There is really a lot to laugh at here. For example, these plans directly affect her and her body, but are spoken to others rather than to her directly. Her childbearing years are way behind her, and plus, they've tried more times than they can count to bear children. Also, a lot of time has passed between when God communicated this promise and now. The laugh might even be tinged with distrust or bitterness. Sarah might be thinking to herself, God, where have you been? But priest and professor Lauren Winner notes another reason that Sarah laughs. Sarah is laughing at the limitations she perceives in herself, at what she thinks she knows about her own body, at the self she thinks is not fit for God's designs. How often do we laugh to ourselves, naming the ways that we are not suited to carry out the work of God? How often do we sense God's desires for ourselves and simply chuckle in disbelief, shake our heads and think, that's impossible? Sarah laughs because it is inconceivable to her that in her current state, she would be anything close to what God needs. All she can see are the boundaries between herself and the work of God. Some take Sarah's response of doubting laughter and lift it up as an example of unfaithfulness, as an illustration of how not to respond to God's calling upon your life. But I see her laugh as all too real and really relatable, and that which actually created the space for her to wrestle with God's plans. And God's response to her confirms this. Sarah's laugh at the absurd-sounding news that she will have a son at 90 does not elicit anger from God, nor does God shame her for feeling this way. Instead, we see that God talks to her. God actually engages her reaction, even though it's not a positive one. Do you remember that funny dialogue between God and Sarah in the text? The statements that are reminiscent of siblings quarreling in the back seat of the minivan heading to the beach. Why did Sarah laugh? I didn't laugh. Oh, yes, you did laugh. That brief exchange there is a little bit of comedic relief in the story. After all, this is a huge moment in the grand narrative of God's saving work. A new line of people from which God's own Son will eventually come is being formed. But underneath the comedy of that exchange is something that we shouldn't miss. That back and forth is meant to reveal this truth, that God knows us. Their conversation is very short. Only a sentence or two do they even share. But it is enough to communicate that the two intimately know each other. God knows Sarah's laugh, even though it was to herself, even though it could not be heard. And likewise, Sarah can sense and fears God's presence, even though God does not announce himself anywhere in the text. God knows and pursues us, even in our doubt and disbelief, and still chooses to use us for his purposes. And can even sense, often better than we can, how we might fit into those divine designs for the world. When we try to go and assign our own roles in the story of God, God has a knack for showing up and making an outrageous claim upon our lives, one that might seem impossible to us. Sarah's understanding of herself as unfit, as incapable of being a part of God's designs, reminds me of the story behind a particular painting in my home, or soon to be hung once the paint dries. It's sitting on the stage right here, and as you can see, it is bright. It is a bright piece made up of greens, yellows, reds, and blues. Big, chunky swaths of color. It depicts 3 or 4 men sitting at a table with cups resting in front of them. The image is pretty abstract, but you can loosely make out the figures. The cups are supposedly filled with coffee, because that is what you drink at an AA meeting. The artist, Jim Bob, is an AA attending, substance abusing schizophrenic. But he's also a painter and a member of Holy Comforter Episcopal Church and a friend. His art represents his own struggles. The scene is of an AA meeting, after all, but it also represents his ability, consciously or not, to take parts of himself that are perceived as limitations or boundaries and use them to create beauty, to create something moving, inspiring, and life-giving for himself and others. His art reminds me that there are always ways for the parts of ourselves that we view as off limits to help accomplish the work of God. Jim Bob's addictions turned beautiful pieces of art, and Sarah's scorn turned promise fulfilled. Reminds us that God uses and needs all sorts of folks for his work in the world, and that the movement of God is unpredictable, and the vessels for that movement unlikely. Just as Sarah listened and laughed, if we listen to God's plans, we should laugh too, because they are absurd. They are reliant on a people who are not, on the surface of things, adequately equipped to even do the work of God. But that is the beauty of worshiping and serving a relational God, a God who comes to us, a God who knows us, a God who talks to us, and a God who understands all parts of us, and asks that we co-labor with him anyway. Sarah quite literally co-labored with God by birthing the child that would make their descendants a great nation. And we too are called to labor to bring new life into the world, new life that points back to God's promised plans of recreation. This new life for each of us might look very different from Sarah's or Jim Bob's. But we can think about and offer up humbly to God those places within us, those parts that make us who we are, that we wouldn't necessarily would think could lead to beauty. And then trust in God's ability to do mysterious, miraculous things. Perhaps that is a relationship you had considered broken or beyond repair, a new vocation that seems daunting but has been quietly speaking to you, a prior mistake or misstep in your life that you have been allowing to define you for too long, or even a part of yourself that is true to your identity but that others have deemed unworthy or unfit for God's designs. If we continue to listen for God's words to us, absurd as they may sound, and we continue to look for God's stubborn promise of new life, perhaps our laughter will turn from doubtful to joyous. And in that space between doubt and joy, may we experience the power of God's transforming grace. For as we learned in Sarah's story, God will faithfully meet us there and gently say, "Is anything too wonderful for the Lord?" The lectionary passage for today concludes with some uncertainty. We cannot yet see the resolution. Sarah's doubting laugh still hangs fresh in the air, and her confusion isn't resolved. And I think that might be intentional. It reminds us that our life of faith is a process, and that we will sit with many emotions along the way. And that is to be expected. That is okay. But if we keep reading into chapter 21, we discover that the story takes a turn. Sarah does indeed give birth, as promised, to a son whom they are instructed by God to name Isaac. And Isaac translates to mean he laughs. We find that God has a sense of humor and does indeed get the last laugh in this story, and seems to say to Sarah, I know you. I have made a promise to you, and I have transformed your once doubtful laughter into joyous laughter. And Sarah knows this too, I think, for she says in chapter 26, verse 6, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. God brings her laughter. This is not her own brand of inward within herself laughter that we saw at the beginning of the story. It is a laughter gifted to her, laughter that is not of her own doing. It is pure grace. This story proves that our life of faith leaves ample room for doubt, for uncertainty, for flat-out disagreement with, and laughing at what God might ask of us. And at the heart of that faith is a God who leaves room for those things while remaining ever constant and unwavering in his promise to us. In the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, we find the main character, Minister John Ames, on his deathbed. He is recounting stories from his long life of ministry and fatherhood, and specifically dwells on the broken, tumultuous relationship with his eldest son. Yearning for forgiveness and reconciliation, and receiving it in unlikely places, he claims, I felt grateful for all my old bitterness of heart. He is awed by the way his woundedness is matched and then exceeded by the healing to come. And we see this in Sarah as well. How much more joyous was the laughter when Isaac was born, because she remembered her doubting laughter months earlier. May we become attuned to the words God might have us hear or overhear, and not be ashamed to laugh within ourselves at their absurdity. And hopefully, not long after, find ourselves trusting in and being surprised by God's promise to birth new life from places we had considered long barren. In the name of God, our Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen.